Hello and welcome everyone. I am your host Patrice, and today we open our doors to our Matrix HSC expert panel, who provide tips, advice and their expertise on how to ace, stay on track and maximise your HSC marks. With many students struggling with English, we know how it can make the subject feel boring and stressful. And you may even start to avoid the subject as you fall further behind, but it doesn't have to be that way. We're here to break down the New South Wales syllabus requirements and get you on track to start acing your HSC marks. In this episode of the Matrix HSC Expert Panels, we're going to talk about how you can ace your HSC for English Standard and how to get the results you need for a Band 6. We'll be covering sample questions and Band 6 responses and the tips and tricks you need to maximise your HSC marks. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Brian McMahon, English teacher at Matrix, as he gives you the advice you'll need to ace your English Standard class. Finally, I'll be here to wrap things up and send you on your way. It's going to be a fun time, so grab a pen and a notebook and let's get learning.
Hello everyone. My name's Brian McMahon. I teach English here at Matrix Education, and it's my pleasure to be talking to you today about the HSC Standard English course. I've been teaching English here to high school students for the past 2 years, and before that I taught in England to both high school and university students. I'm passionate about literature and passionate about helping students to achieve their goals, so let's see if we can do a little bit of that today. Now, English is the one subject which is compulsory for all HSC students. For some people, that's good news, but for others it can be a source of frustration, particularly if you feel that English isn't your natural best subject. English is quite a difficult subject to define, and many students find it difficult to pin down why it is that their marks in English tend to fluctuate up and down, whereas in other subjects your marks might be a little bit more stable, a little bit more predictable. Well, English belongs to a family of subjects called the humanities. Together with disciplines like history, philosophy and religious studies, English is concerned with the study of A, what makes human beings tick, and B, how do human beings write, talk and otherwise express their humanity. Unlike maths or science, which are concerned with describing observable phenomena in the world and organising the world into sets of systems, English is more concerned with difficult grey areas such as emotion, empathy, memory, storytelling, and artistic representation. One of the challenges students often report when they're studying English is a perception that there are no right answers, unlike in subjects like maths or the sciences. Now, this isn't necessarily true, but what is true is that English examiners are much less interested in what you conclude than they are in how you got there. It's more about process in English than it is about results. English is assessed in several different ways, mostly through essays, which are long-form written arguments, but also through presentations, short responses, and sometimes oral exercises like delivering a speech to your classmates. So there are a range of different styles of expression that you need to get good at in order to succeed in the HSC. And the skills you'll need to receive high marks require you to be less concerned with problem solving and more interested in formulating arguments, writing and speaking persuasively, expressing yourself in ways that are plausible and communicate your ideas clearly, in some sense regardless of whether those ideas are themselves good or bad. One of the major areas where English students fail sometimes to live up to their potential in assessments occurs when they simply misunderstand the task, or the examiner is asking something that they haven't quite appreciated or got their heads around. It's easy to misread a question or overthink it, giving the examiner what you imagine they must want, rather than giving them what they've actually asked for. It can be helpful to think of Year 12 English lessons as covering two really quite different areas of study. The first is English itself, how to read critically, how to turn your critical reading into essays, how to present your ideas and write about things like technique, effect, audience and context. Much of this will be familiar to you from throughout your high school career, and Year 12 lessons, in one sense, just build on the foundations that you've already laid. But the second area your Year 12 lessons will cover is exam strategy and assessment technique. It's one thing to know a lot about a text, a novel, say, or a play, but another thing entirely to boil down that knowledge into a 5 or 7 mark exam answer produced under timed conditions and without access to the text itself. Often, we find that students who excel at English in terms of their knowledge and understanding of the subject fail to ace their exams because they're uncertain about how to translate that knowledge and understanding into the kind of bite-sized, carefully constructed responses that the examiner is looking for. There's also the issue of how to respond to a question which is open-ended. When you read the marking criteria for most HSC subjects, they tend to include the correct answer, which scores full marks. And sometimes they'll refer to other, less correct responses which receive fewer marks, but in English, there are sometimes an infinite number of possible right answers and different ways to respond to a question, all of which could potentially score top marks. So this great variety can sometimes seem confusing, frustrating, even overwhelming. The key when studying English is to think of yourself not as a doctor trying to diagnose a cause of illness, but rather as a lawyer trying to argue a case. The evidence before you could be adapted to tell all kinds of stories, but your task is to pick just one and present it in the most compelling way possible. So let me give you one example. Let's take Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which some of you might have studied. This play has a protagonist who's motivated by ambition and who does terrible things. Should the audience view him sympathetically despite all of that? This is one of those open-ended questions I was just talking about, and there's no right or wrong answer. Instead, you can argue either side of the issue. On the one hand, you might concentrate on the evidence which presents him as ruthless and cruel. He's a murderer. He even arranges for his best friend to be killed. He betrays his king. He becomes a tyrant. Evidence supporting all of these statements can be found throughout the play. But on the other hand, you could go the other way. You might say that Macbeth does terrible things, yes, but this doesn't stop the audience from caring about him. You could paint a picture of a tortured man, torn between his love of his country, his wife, and his own ambition. You could present him as someone whose world falls apart because he does one stupid, wicked thing once and pays the heaviest of prices for it. You can portray him as a man without free will who is controlled by wicked witches, and you can do all of this with the full support of evidence found throughout the play. So which argument is better? Which one should receive the higher mark? The answer is that it depends on how the argument is structured and how compellingly it is expressed. Neither argument is necessarily stronger, and no examiner or marker will judge your work based just on these comments. Instead, what they're interested in is how well you present the comments. As I say, think of yourself as a lawyer arguing your case in front of a judge. The examiner is that judge, and it's them you need to convince. If this makes English sound very different from a subject like science or maths, that's because it is. Recognising this and accepting it is the first step towards solving the problem of how to ace your English HSCs and prepare in such a way that your marks become predictably and consistently better throughout the year. So much for the abstract ideas. Let's take a look now at the English standard course itself and think about how we can approach the kinds of tasks it involves effectively, thinking not like doctors or scientists, but like lawyers with a case to win. The English standard course is divided into 4 parts. Here's how NESA, the examining body, describes it. The course provides students with the opportunity to explore and experiment with the ways events, experiences, ideas and processes are represented in and through a range of texts. Students strengthen their knowledge and understanding of language and literature by responding to and composing a wide variety of texts for different audiences and purposes. The first module you'll study is the Common module. It gets its name from the fact that it's common to English Standard and English Advanced. The subject is texts and human experiences, and in practice this means that you'll need to study one prescribed text chosen by your school and a related text chosen by you. You'll be assessed by your school teacher, then in your trials, and finally in the HSC itself. The common module is assessed on paper 1, which is worth 40% of the overall HSC exam mark. And on this paper you'll write a single essay about the text you've studied, and then several shorter responses to questions about unseen texts, which you'll encounter for the first time when you open the exam paper. The rest of the English Standard course is divided between Module A, Language, Identity and Culture, where you'll study a single text, Module B, the close study of literature, where again you'll study a single text, and Module C, the craft of writing, where you'll study 2 shorter texts and develop your own ability as a writer of imaginative and discursive texts. To give you a sense of the kind of work you'll be doing when you engage with the texts you'll study for the HSC, I'm going to take you through a couple of exam questions, but before we get to that, I want to remind you that any good lawyer concentrates on appealing to the judge and pays close attention to their questions. In this case, you're the lawyer and the examiner is the judge, so the first step to doing well in the HSC is to pay close attention to what they're asking you for. Now let's take a look at our first sample question. This is from the Common Module sample paper published by Nessa in 2017. On this paper you have to respond to texts you've not previously studied, so it's doubly important to understand how to do this well under time pressure, since you'll have to practice writing about these particular texts. In this case, we're faced with a poem, but before we read it, let's look at what the examiner is asking us to do. The question asks, how does the poem convey what is valued by the persona? Question's worth 3 marks. If I tell you that questions on this paper can be worth anything between 3 and 20 marks, you'll immediately realise that this is a relatively low value question, meaning that only a short response is called for. The question shouldn't take you long in an exam, roughly 5 to 7 minutes, so how to maximise that time and ensure you bank all 3 of those marks before moving on? The solution lies in first recognising what the examiner is asking you to do. It's important not to overcomplicate this. The first word of the question is how, and that is important. If the question asked, what values does the poem convey, then the answer would be simply to summarise the contents of the poem. But the word how alerts us to the fact that the examiner wants to know about technique. Whatever values are represented here, the issue is how the reader's attention is drawn to them. So straight away we know we're being asked about technique. And this is what I mean when I encourage you to think like an examiner and familiarise yourself with the vocabulary they use and what they mean by these key words. So the next key word in this question is valued. The theme of our response should be built around this idea of value. If we write a generalised response about the poem, simply listing such features as the use of metaphor, rhyme, strong imagery and so on, but fail to refer to the concept of value, then we're simply not giving the examiner what they've asked for. In this way, English is actually quite a lot like maths. If in a maths exam you were asked to calculate the square root of 9 and instead wrote that 4 cubed is 64, you wouldn't score the marks. And that's not because you've written something inaccurate, but simply because you've ignored what the examiner is asking for. In other words, you've answered the wrong question. Believe it or not, this is the single most common mistake students make in HSC English, to ignore or misunderstand the question. And it's the surest way to lose marks. So to do well here, we need to think about A, what values are expressed in the poem, and B, how they are expressed, again thinking about technique. Lastly, notice that the question makes reference to the persona. This is a technical term which simply means the speaking voice or the narrator of the poem. Being comfortable using technical terms is an important part of doing well in HSC English, but don't misunderstand that to mean that simply listing a whole lot of technical terms will impress the examiner and gain you marks. On the contrary, it's not what you do or what you know, but what you do with what you know that counts. To summarise, the question is asking us what techniques this poet has used to communicate the speaker's set of values. So now that we understand what we're being asked, let's turn to the poem itself and have a read. Of course, in an exam, you're not permitted to read texts out loud. When you're studying them in school, though, or at home, it's often a good technique to use for unlocking meaning. And in particular, whenever you're analysing a poem, make sure you understand what it means before you dive into the techniques used to construct and communicate that meaning. When you read a poem out loud, let yourself be guided by the punctuation, rather than by where the lines begin and end. Here we go. Where am I? I am desperate for connection. I must have hit a black spot. The sun is glaring at me and blinding my display screen. All I can see is my own face. Coarse sand has crept between my toes. I've wandered too far. I need to Google a map, text someone who will reconnect me. This shell, this sand, the smell of rotting kelp. I poke at the dead things with pieces of driftwood. This strange salty wind, seagulls and what look out. How can a message washed up in an old bottle compare to my new slate black iPhone? First question, what's going on here? What's the poem actually about? Answer, the persona speaks of being in a sunny, sandy environment, that they express their sense of desperation at being cut off from contact with others. The imagery suggests a shipwreck or desert island, contrasted with the interconnectedness symbolised by the new slate black iPhone. The poet W.B. Yeats claimed that the key to getting the most out of a poem was to read it slowly, so let's do that now. Remember that in the exam we'd only have between 5 and 7 minutes to answer this question, but fortunately the exams aren't yet upon us, so we can afford to take our time to practice our reading. Remember that the question is about values. It's also about techniques. Remember also that the question asks about the persona's values, and that there's no guarantee these will overlap with either the poets or the readers. The title, first of all, sets the tone. Don't ignore text titles. They can be just as instructive as the passage themselves. Where am I is a simple, basic question, and one we all ask ourselves, both when we're literally lost and when we're lost in a metaphorical sense. When we don't know who we are anymore, we don't know if we're coming or going. Which is it in this case? Maybe both. Let's read on. I'm desperate for connection. This is a short sentence, just 5 words, but such a strong emotion, desperation. The choice of words is not accidental. The poet could just as easily have written, I am anxious or I desire connection. Instead, we read that they are desperate. Think about how this makes us feel. What technique is the poet using here? I must have hit a black spot. What could that mean? It's a visual image, that much is clear. Hit is a strong word with violent connotations. You might also know that in old tales of pirates, a black spot was the mark of a cursed man. But what if you don't know that? It doesn't matter. A black spot could equally be associated with a road junction with a notoriously high accident rate, or with a spot on the body, which is the sign of an illness. My point again is that the conclusion matters less than your reasoning, your argumentation. In line 3, notice what the sun is doing. It's glaring, but that can't literally be true. The sun is a star, incapable of emotion. So what's going on here is an example of personification or figurative language. Well, that's all well and good, but ask yourself why? What does this add to our sense of the persona and what he or she values? Stick to the question. Don't neglect that key word value. The sun is, quote, blinding my display screen. This is another confusing image. When you stop to think about it, how can a screen go blind? It doesn't have any eyes. What does it mean that the persona invests their iPhone with such a human quality? Really, the light is so strong it's temporarily blinding the persona, but the grammar of this sentence implies it's the screen that goes blind, so the persona is transferring what happens to them onto their device. Is this healthy? What does this suggest about the value with which they're investing that device? All I can see is my own face. Again, it's like looking in a mirror, isn't it? The persona looks at the phone, which is designed as a technology to connect us with other people, and sees only themselves. Now, the imagery in the next line jars with what has come before. The coarseness of the sand makes it sound unpleasant. Coarse is an onomatopoeic word. And yet we stereotypically enjoy the sensation being described here, the feeling of sand underfoot on a beach. So the poet is subverting our sense of how we relate to the natural world. What does this suggest about what the persona does and does not value? And then we've got the word Google, the word iPhone. These stand out because they're modern, corporate, technological words. They seem somehow stranded in a poem which is otherwise made up of much more natural images: sand, seagulls, salt wind, shells. Notice how all these words alliterate, reinforcing the connection between them. Little in the poem alliterates with Google or with iPhone. They stand out, deliberately so. The poet writes, "I need to Google a map, text someone who will reconnect me." Now, this is written in the form of a statement, but notice where the line break falls. The last part looks like it should be a question: who will reconnect me? Perhaps the poem contains a plea for connection. Perhaps it's being connected that the persona values most. Now, I could go on, but remember, this is a 3-mark question, and part of the skill required to do well at English is to know when to add and when to stop. Examiners don't expect you to say everything you can about a text. Instead, you need to be selective, choosing only your best ideas and threading them together in a compelling, persuasive response, again, like a lawyer addressing a courtroom. So let's have a go at that now. Just before we do, let's have a quick read over the marking criteria so we know what the examiner wants from us. So for 3 marks, an answer must demonstrate an understanding of how the poem conveys what is valued by the persona. Okay. For 2 marks, demonstrate some understanding of how the poem conveys what is valued by the persona. And for 1 mark, provide some relevant information. The main thing you'll notice about these criteria is that they're quite similar and they don't sound too demanding. You might also notice what's absent. No mention of clever technical terms, no requirement to sound smart or write in a way that is rhetorically exciting. Instead, what examiners really want is A, clarity, B, detail, and C, they want you to actually answer the question they've set. Notice the emphasis they put on 2- and 3-mark responses, demonstrating understanding of how the poem conveys what is valued by the persona. Now, if we hadn't taken the time to recognise that how, valued, and persona are the key words in this question, we might have produced something quite different. So when you're preparing for the HSC, it's so important to read documents like marking criteria, sample responses, examiner commentaries, and the NESA website. You'll also want to consult resources like the Matrix Education website, which includes a guide to the prescriptions for English Standard, together with a large number of resources designed to support your study of particular texts and your preparation for each of the 4 modules. Bearing all this in mind, let's take a look at a sample response to the 3-mark question we've been discussing. Here goes. The poem conveys the idea that the persona values connection through technology over solitude in a natural environment. This is communicated through the use of the onomatopoeic word coarse used to describe the sand, which they find unpleasant, an example of tactile imagery. On the other hand, the strong emotional force of the word desperate in the opening line conveys the intensity of their longing for connection. The reflection of my own face in the blank screen of the iPhone reinforces their sense of loneliness, while the negative connotations of glaring and blinding personify the sun as an aggressive, negative force in contrast to the positive value they place on technology. That's it. Notice how little we actually included of the analysis we did a moment ago. This is what I mean about the importance of being selective. Doing well in your HSC requires you to strike a balance between deep knowledge and understanding on the one hand, and giving the examiner what they've asked for in the time allowed on the other. This is a 3-mark question. You only have about 6 minutes to answer it, so a single paragraph is really all that's called for. What's good about this response? Well, ask yourself, does it answer the question? In the words of the marking criteria, does it demonstrate an understanding of how the poem conveys what is valued by the persona? It does. The keywords persona and value are used repeatedly, indicating that the focus is on the question which was posed. Several of the techniques the poet has used are identified: onomatopoeia, tactile imagery, emotionally charged vocabulary, negative connotations, personification. And the effect of each is briefly explained. The response packs in a lot of dense content and draws it all together neatly in the opening sentence. Is this the correct way to answer the question? Well, it's certainly not the only way. Here's another response to the same question, this time one provided by the examiners themselves as an example of how to score a top mark. The persona value is being connected to the world through technology. This is expressed through the emotive word desperate in the first line, reinforced in the last two lines with a comparison between old methods of communication, message in an old bottle, and new methods, the slate black iPhone. The rhetorical question in the final line reinforces the value placed on the technology. I actually prefer our response, but both would score the full 3 marks. And that's the thing about English, which sets it apart from subjects like science and maths. We're not so interested in the destination, remember. Our focus is always on the journey. So much for a low-value 3-mark question. But what about an essay? Typically, students find that crafting essays and other lengthier pieces of writing is the most challenging part of studying English. But it doesn't have to be. The trick is to learn a fixed structure and then tailor the content to the particular question you have been asked. Let's look at another example, this time from the Module B section of the HSC paper. For English Standard, Module B is all about the close study of literature, which is defined as a detailed study and discussion of a single text. Doing well in Module B involves deploying those same skills of careful reading and analysis, which we just applied to the poem Where Am I?, but adapting them to fit the form of an essay response. Sometimes the word essay can be a bit off-putting, but it's helpful to start with a definition. An essay is simply an extended argument, either in favour of something or against it. That's all we're talking about here. Essays are examples of persuasive writing, which use evidence from one or more texts to support a thesis, that is, point of view. HSC essays come in 3 parts: the introduction, between 2 and 4 body paragraphs, which contain the bulk of your analysis, and the conclusion. Let's look at a sample Module B question. This question refers to a novel by the English writer Mark Haddon. You don't need to be at all familiar with the text to follow my discussion, but I'll just start you off with a quick summary so that we're all on the same page. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time is a novel by Mark Haddon. The story begins when 15-year-old Christopher discovers the dead body of a dog belonging to his neighbour, Mrs. Shears. The dog has been killed with a garden fork. Christopher is appalled by this and decides to find out who killed him. In the course of his investigation, Christopher discovers that he has been lied to about his mother's death and that his father has been keeping him in the dark about a range of family secrets. That's all you need to know for now. I'm keen to avoid spoilers in case you end up reading or studying this novel for the HSC. Let's just take a look at an essay question about this text and discuss how we might approach it, thinking again like a lawyer and conscious of the pressures of time and space which exams put us under. So here's the question we're going to tackle. Literature reinforces or challenges our understanding of ordinary situations. Discuss this statement, making detailed references to your prescribed text. Once again, the trick here is to pay attention to the key words the examiners have used in order to determine what they're really asking us to do. Because an essay is by definition a piece of persuasive writing, our task is to decide whether we agree with the statement that literature reinforces or challenges our understanding of ordinary situations, disagree with it, or fall somewhere in the middle. It's important to recognise that discuss doesn't just mean talk in general terms about something. What the examiner is actually asking us to do is present a particular point of view. In this case, we might choose to argue that literature, that is, texts like novels, plays, films, and so on, reinforces our understanding of what is and is not ordinary, in other words, it affirms our existing views, or that it causes us to reassess those views. You could also argue that it does both of these things, or if you really wanted to challenge yourself, that it does neither. The question sounds quite open-ended, but note that there's another element to it. We need to respond by making detailed reference to our prescribed text. We can't just talk in general terms, because we need to support our argument with quotations from and analysis of the curious incident of the dog in the night time. So how should we proceed? Well, every good essay begins with a thesis statement and a short introduction. What I mean by that is a summary of what we will be arguing, and it's really important not to overcomplicate this. Sometimes students invent thesis statements which are impossibly ambitious for a 40-minute exam task, so be realistic about how much ground you have to cover. The other trap to avoid falling into is beginning your essay in a non-committal way, refusing to argue one way or the other. Examiners expect you to attempt to persuade them. That's the whole point of the exercise. Again, think like a lawyer. Saying, "I don't know whether or not my client is guilty," is unlikely to win the argument. You need to be bold, but you need to have the evidence to back up the boldness of any claims that you might make. So let's take a look at an introduction. Very briefly, here you can see the marking criteria are similar to those we looked at for the earlier question we examined on the poem. How's this for an opening paragraph, a thesis statement and introduction? Literature both comments on and helps to shape a reader's sense of what is ordinary. In Mark Haddon's novel The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, the distinctive perspective, behaviour and narrative voice of the protagonist, Christopher Boone, serve both to reinforce the reader's initial impression that he is unusual and to challenge our standards for what constitutes ordinary behaviour and whether this definition is fair and socially useful. Is that true? For our purposes, that's the wrong question to be asking. It would be better to ask, is that persuasive? And just as importantly, does it answer the question? If the answer to both the questions I've just asked is yes, then our introduction succeeds. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole of the essay here. We don't really have time to unpack it, and unless you've read the novel, it won't make a great deal of sense. But the key point to appreciate is that whether it be the introduction, the body, or the conclusion, what distinguishes a high-scoring essay from any other kind is this consistent use of a persuasive approach, working in such a way that, like a lawyer, you take apart the question, examine the key words, and present a response which is plausible, persuasive, consistent, and logical, regardless of whether or not what you write is true. Truth in English essays is a matter of opinion, and examiners don't award marks for it. What they are marking is your ability to write in a way that is cogent, coherent, and logical. So how then do we take these ideas forward and get you to a point where you feel confident to ace the English standard exams and assessments? Well, at Matrix, our Year 12 courses are designed to be practical, hands-on, and applied. We're not interested in simply repeating what your school covers with you. We want to take your knowledge and help you to channel it into written responses which meet the marking criteria and elevate your work to the highest band you're capable of achieving. Our courses have been designed by subject matter experts who've gone through similar exams themselves and done remarkably well. They've brought together all their knowledge and understanding in a format that is accessible, individuated, and engaging. We offer courses targeted at your level of study, and our English Standard courses are quite different from our English Advanced courses. They're taught by teachers who really know the syllabus inside and out. We teach in small classes, and we offer the option of online or in-person courses, allowing you to advance in a more or less structured way depending on your learning preferences. Our theory books are unique to Matrix and contain a wealth of resources, including clear, well-structured explainers of all aspects of the English Standard HSC course. We begin with the common module, with resources tailored to cover each of the 14 possible prescribed texts and prepare you for the work you'll need to do in responding to unseen texts, like the poem I discussed earlier. You complete written work each week, which is marked and returned with detailed feedback. Your teacher will guide you as an individual, meeting you where you are and supporting you with personalised advice and goals. We're able to advise on the choice of a related text, how to design your study notes, and how to craft an essay which covers all the marking criteria. Our weekly classes are supported with the opportunity for you to attend group tutorials to raise questions and receive further feedback, as well as one-on-one tutorials in which you can sit down with the tutor for an hour and hash out whatever is challenging you in the course. For Module A and Module B, we offer classes which cover the most popular of the prescribed texts currently on offer in New South Wales schools. We're adding to these courses all the time, and we welcome feedback about which texts you'd like us to cover next. If we don't have a course for your text available just at the moment, you can enrol on our Module C course, which covers all the set texts for that paper and many more besides, and is focused on strengthening your skills as a creative writer. Again, you receive individual feedback and a selection of learning tools and practical methods which can help you think like an examiner and refine the way you write about the texts you're studying in exams and assessments. One of the things we hear most often at Matrix is that students feel their schools cover all the content of the course, but sometimes leave them insufficiently confident when preparing for exams and assessments, and that's where we come in. As I mentioned earlier, there are two equally important skill sets to develop in Year 12, being good at English and being good at English exams. Our Matrix courses cover the first in detail, but never at the expense of the second, which we recognise as crucial for your success. So that's all I have to cover with you today. It's been my pleasure to talk to you a little bit about the HSC Standard English course, and I'll just leave you with mention of the Matrix website, which is full of a wealth of resources, including downloadable model answers, study guides, and the contact details should you want to get in touch with us and pursue any questions you might have about Matrix education. And that brings us to the end of today's seminar. Thank you very much for your attention. We've covered the ways in which English is different from other HSC subjects, but however different, it's also compulsory, so it's important to get on top of it early. It requires you to think like a lawyer rather than a scientist, focusing not so much on calculation as on argument, and working out how to articulate complex themes and ideas, often to do with grey areas like emotion, empathy, memory and experience. It's a challenging subject, but hugely rewarding, and it's been my pleasure to discuss it with you here today.
Thank you for joining us today for Matrix's HSC Expert Webinar panel. Today we have covered how you can ace your HSC English for Standard with sample questions and sample responses. Thank you to all of our incredible students and their friends for attending our Matrix HSC Expert panel. We hope we have empowered you with all the knowledge and tools you need to study effectively. We look forward to seeing you in the future at events, and best of luck for your HSC.